In this video for absolute beginners, I'm going to show you how to get started with HTML, CSS and JavaScript by creating this simple, beautiful and responsive product page website in around 2 hours. If you're new here, my name's Danny. I'm an indie app developer and creator of Fudgit. If you want to learn about web development and loads of other good stuff, click subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss anything. Every subscription helps me to create more content for this channel. Don't worry if you have no experience with web development, because we're going to go through absolutely everything step by step. So we're going to start by installing the text editor that we're going to be using to create our website, which is VSCode, which you see over on the left here. And then we're just going to work on HTML. We're going to create this web page by just using HTML. And at this point, it's going to look something like this, not very pretty. And then we're going to move on to CSS, where we're going to use the magic of CSS to transform this page into something like this. And we're also going to use CSS to make it responsive so that the layout changes on mobile, so that this web page looks good for anybody who's viewing it, regardless of their device. And once we're done with CSS, we're going to move on to JavaScript. And we're just going to add a little bit of JavaScript to make this cookies banner appear after about 2 seconds and make it disappear when the user clicks on this close button. And then at the end, we're going to add some finishing touches, such as adding a second page, this about page that you see here. Now, obviously, I can't teach you everything there is to know about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in this one video, but you will learn a little bit about each of these, and most importantly, how they all work and how they all fit together in the creation of a website. Let's get started by installing the text editor that we're going to be using to create this website, which is Visual Studio Code, or VS Code as it's generally known. So you just want to go to Google and search for VS Code. And you want to jump to this code.visualstudio.com website. And you want to download this for your platform and install it. Okay, so it's finished downloading the zip, so I'm just going to open that up. And on a Mac, I just need to drag this into my applications folder. But if you're on Windows, then you might need to actually run an installer. Well, I'm just going to drag this Visual Studio Code app into my applications folder. And I should now be able to launch this. So I'm just going to go to Applications and launch Visual Studio Code. Click on Open, and you should see something like this. Now with VS Code, we can install extensions which help us with our development. And there is one extension that we're going to need in this video, which is the live server extension, which will help us to launch our website in the browser and also see any changes that we make to our website in real time. So you just want to click on this extensions button over on the left here, or if you don't see that, then you can go to View and Extensions. I'm just going to click on this button and you want to search for live server, hit enter. Click on this top item and you just want to click on this install button. And that's now installed. And if it asks you to restart VS Code, then just close it and restart it again. Okay, our editor is installed and set up. So let's create our first HTML page. So we're going to need somewhere to store this website. So we're going to need a folder. So I'm going to create a folder on my desktop, and you can create a folder anywhere you want. It doesn't need to be on the desktop, but I'm going to create it on the desktop. And I'm going to name it HTML-CSS-JavaScript-basics. And you don't need to use that name. You can use any name you want. And now we just want to drag this folder into VS Code. So I'm just going to get VS Code up again and then drag this folder into it. And it's now opened our folder for us. And this here is where all of our files will be seen. So let's create our first HTML file. So you just want to right click in this space here. And by the way, if you don't see this Explorer panel, then just go to View and Explorer and it should show it for you. But you want to right click and click on New File. And we're going to call this file index.html. And this file name does need to end with .html because that tells the browser that this is a HTML file. And I would recommend that you use the name index.html because when you visit a website, such as code.visualstudio.com/, then the first web page that it's going to look for is index.html. Okay, so we can see that it's already opened this file for us, index.html. We can see it here. We can see index.html in this tab. I'm just going to close this welcome tab. And VS Code makes it really easy for us to scaffold an initial HTML page and add all of the basic tags that we need. So you just want to type in doc and you should see this Emmet abbreviation pop up. And Emmet is an extension that's built into VS Code, which helps us to write HTML and CSS more quickly. Well, once you see that little pop up, just hit enter and it will scaffold an initial HTML page for us. And I'll explain what's going on here in a minute, but for now we just want to save this by going to File and Save, or you can use the keyboard shortcut that you see here. So I'm just going to use that keyboard shortcut to save this. And now let's launch this web page using the live server extension that we installed before. And to do this, you just want to go to View and Command Palette, or you can use this keyboard shortcut that you see here. And this will launch the command palette where we can launch all of the commands available to us within VS Code, including any commands from any extensions that we've installed. And you just want to search for live, and you can see this option here open with live server. So I'm just going to click on that, and it's now opened up our HTML page in the browser. And we don't see anything on the page, and I'll explain why that is in a little bit. But first of all, what is HTML? Well, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And HTML is not a programming language such as JavaScript. So we can't use logic in HTML such as if this thing is true, then do this, or if this other thing is true, then do that. It's purely a presentation language which tells the browser what elements should be displayed on the page. And by elements, I mean things like headings, paragraphs, tables, images, lists, and stuff like that. And HTML also doesn't tell the browser how these elements should look. That's what CSS is for, which we'll get to later. And by the end of this HTML section of the video, our web page is going to look something like this. And you can see that it's pretty ugly. So all the HTML is doing is telling the browser what elements should be on the page, such as these headings and this paragraph and this image, but it doesn't tell the browser how these elements should look. It just spits them out on the page using the browser's default style for these elements. And so HTML is made up of tags. And we can already see some tags on the page here. I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller. And in fact, I'm just going to hide this sidebar. So if you just go to View and Appearance and click on Show Sidebar or use the keyboard shortcut, then it'll hide the sidebar so that we have more space. So most tags are made up of a pair of an opening tag and a closing tag, such as this title tag that we can see here. So the opening tag is just made up of a left angle bracket, then the name of the tag, then a right angle bracket, and then the closing tag is made up of a left angle bracket and then a forward slash, then the name of the tag, and then a closing right angle bracket. And we also have self-closing tags, such as this meta tag that you can see here. You can see that this tag doesn't have a closing tag. So I'll just explain what these tags are. And just to make it a bit clearer what's going on, I'm just going to place my cursor after this closing body tag here and click with the left mouse button and drag up to the start of this head tag and hit tab to indent that. And so this HTML tag basically just tells the browser that this is a HTML page. And we can see the closing tag for that down here. And this HTML tag needs to be the root tag on our page. And all the other tags should come inside these two tags. And this head tag is for adding tags which give the browser information about our page. For example, this title tag tells the browser what title should be displayed in the tab in the browser here. So you can see inside this title tag, we can see the word document, and that's what we see here in this tab, document. And so if we change this text inside this tag to, let's say, orange, and we save that, we can see it change to orange in the browser. However, tags that are inside this head tag are not displayed on the page. They only give the browser information, such as the title of the page. And this meta tag here just tells the browser what character set to use, and we don't really need to worry about that too much. And this other meta tag is basically just telling the browser how to render this page in the browser. And we don't need to worry about this too much, but this is basically just telling the browser to set the width of our page to the device's width, and also not to zoom into or out of the page, and just set the initial zoom or initial scale to 1. And we can also add other meta tags here, such as a meta tag to provide a description of our web page for search engines, or a meta tag to provide a list of keywords for search engines as well. But if we want to create a tag or an element that actually appears on the page, then we need to put it inside these body tags. So all of the elements that we actually see on the page will go inside these body tags. So I'll just quickly cover some of the tags that we can add here. So the first type of tags that we can add are heading tags. And the most important heading is the H1 tag. So if we just add a left angle bracket and then H1 and then a closing right angle bracket, and you can see it's automatically added the closing tag. But if it hasn't added that, then just type this out. So left angle bracket / H1 right angle bracket. And so we can place some heading text inside this tag. So this is a heading. Save that. And we can see that heading on the page. And we also have H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. So I'll just add those as well. And by the way, a shortcut for adding HTML tags is just to type in the name of the tag, such as H2. And you should see this Emmet abbreviation thing pop up. And you can just hit tab or hit enter and it'll add the tag for us. So I'll just put some text in there. And I'll add H3 and a H4. H5 and H6. Save that, and we can see all of these headings on the page, and you can see that by default the text gets smaller for each level of heading. And we also have a paragraph tag for adding paragraphs. So this is just a P tag, so you can just type in P, hit tab, and it'll add a paragraph tag. And a quick way of adding some dummy text in VS Code is just typing in lorem. And you can see Emmet abbreviation and just hit enter and it'll add a bunch of text. So I'll save that and we can see we have a paragraph here. And we also have a couple of different list elements for displaying lists. So first of all, we have an unordered list. So if you just type in UL for unordered lists and hit enter, and inside that you want to add an LI element, list item, and you can put some text in there. And I'll just add another LI in there, enter some text, and then another LI and save that. And you can see a list there with bullet points at the start. We also have an ordered list, which will number the items starting at 1. So I'm just going to add a new line here and select this UL element and copy it with Command and C, or it might be Control and C on your device, and then paste it down here. I'm just going to change this opening and closing tag to OL instead of UL and save that. And you can see this list has numbered items. And these elements are all what's known as block level elements. And block level elements will always be placed on a new line. So you can see all of these elements are being placed on a new line. They're not placed alongside each other from left to right. They're just being stacked one after the other. So these are block elements. But we also have inline elements which won't be placed on a new line, such as the strong tag, which will make text bold. So if I just surround this word here in some strong tags like this, I'm just going to double click this word and then drag it into the middle of these tags and save that. And we can see this word is bold, but it's not placed this text on a new line because this is an inline tag or an inline element. And we also have the EM tag, which is an inline element. So if I just drag this word into these EM tags and save that, you can see that this gives the text an italic style. And there's also a bunch of other elements that we can use, such as tables and inputs. And I'm not going to get into them all now, but these are some of the main ones. So these are some of the elements that we actually see on the page, but we also have semantic or structural elements, which we don't actually see on the page, but which give the different sections of our page some meaning. And they also help search engines to understand the structure of our page as well. So I'm just going to delete all of these tags that we've added in the body tag. So just to demonstrate some of these semantic or structural elements, we have a header element, which is where you might place your website's header. We have a footer element where you might place the footer. We have a section element, which you might use to surround a blog section, for example. And within that section tag, you might have an article tag where you would display each blog article within one of those. And we also have a nav element where you might add some navigation. And we have an aside element where you might place a sidebar. And if we have a section of our page which doesn't really fit into any of these semantic tags, then we can just use a div tag. I'm just going to save this, and you can see we now see absolutely nothing on the page because these tags don't actually add anything to the page. They just allow us to structure our page in a logical way, which helps us as developers to understand what's going on the page, and also helps search engines and SEO search engine optimization as well. And there's also a bunch of other tags that we can use, but I'm just going to cover these ones for now. Let's get started creating the HTML for our header. And if I just jump to the finished page, so we're just going to have a really simple header with a grey background, a logo on the left, and a couple of navigation items on the right, which will link to the two different pages. So it makes sense to put our header within a header element. So I'm just going to jump back to our web page, and I'm going to delete all of these elements apart from the header element. And I'm just going to place my cursor in between these two tags and hit enter. And we'll place all of our header elements in here. And for now, we're not going to add this logo. We're just going to add a H1 tag, a heading tag with the name of our website inside it. It's a good idea to have the name of your website or company within a H1 within the header, because search engines will assume that this is your website name or company name. So we're just going to add a H1 tag by typing H1 and hitting enter or tab. And we'll just put the name of our website in there. And I'm just going to call this website Orange, and I'll save that. And we can now see this heading on the page. And now we're going to add these navigation items, and we usually put navigation items within a nav tag. So after this H1 tag, I'm going to add a new line and add a nav element. So I'm going to type in nav and hit enter, add a new line, and we'll place our navigation items here. And we usually do this within a unordered list. So I'm going to add a UL tag, and within that, I'm going to add some LI tags. And I'm just going to copy these LI tags and paste them on the next line. So we have two. And we can add links to our page by using the A tag or anchor tag. So I'm going to place my cursor inside these first LI tags, type in A and hit enter, and it's added an anchor tag for us. And we put the text that we want to display in this link inside these anchor tags. So I'm just going to put home inside those tags and hit save, and we can see a link there. So I'm just going to copy this anchor tag and paste it inside this second LI, change the text to about, because this will be a link to our about page, and I'll save that. And I'm also going to surround this orange text in an anchor tag as well. And one way we can quickly surround some text in a tag is to select the text and launch the command palette by choosing View and Command Palette, or using the keyboard shortcut, and type in wrap. And we can use this wrap with abbreviation command. So I'm going to fire that by hitting enter, and then type in the name of the tag we want to wrap, which is an A tag, and hit enter again. And it's now wrapped this text in an anchor tag. And lots of tags have attributes. And this is an attribute here, this href attribute. And the structure of an attribute is generally the name of the attribute, and then equals, and then some speech marks. And we generally place the value inside these speech marks. And this href attribute tells the browser which path this link should go to. And for now, I'm just going to set all of these href attributes to go to the root of our app, so to the home page. And the root of our website is always at /. So I'm just going to put / in each of these and save that. And if we now click on these links, they all take us to the home page. And you can also see in the address bar, we no longer see /index.html here, because as I mentioned earlier on, when you hit the website without specifying a particular page, such as /about.html, it will always look for index.html first, which is why it's loading this page in the browser. Okay, finally, let's just add another tag after our header, which will add a horizontal line across the page, just to split things up a bit for us. So after this header, I'm going to add a new line and another new line, and we're going to add a HR tag, or horizontal rule. I'll hit enter and save that, and we can now see a line across the page. And I'm just going to use these HRs to split up the different sections of our page so we can see what's going on before we start making our website look pretty with CSS. But we are going to hide these horizontal rules later on using CSS. Okay, let's add some HTML for our product now. So I'm just going to go to the finished page. So we have a list of products here. So it probably makes sense to put all of these products within a section element, and then put each individual product within an article element. And within those article elements, we can place all of these elements. So it probably makes sense to use a H1 heading for this heading here, and a H2 heading for this price heading, and then a paragraph for this text here, and then a nav element for these navigation items here, with a UL element inside that, with some LIs and some links, just like we did for our header navigation. And then we're going to need an image element for this image. So I'm going to jump back to the page, And after this HR, we're going to add a section element. And we're going to place all of these products inside this section element. And then we're going to place each individual product inside an article element. So I'll add that. And so for this text here, we could probably use our H1 heading. So let's add a H1 here. And I'll just add this text, the new OMAC, amazing, full stop. And I'll put this price inside a H2. So I'll add a new line and a H2. And we'll put from $2,699. Then I'll add a new line and add a paragraph tag for this text. And just to add some lorem ipsum, I'm just going to type in lorem and hit enter. And I'll save that. And let's see how that's looking. Okay, this is looking okay. So let's add our navigation items. So I'm actually just going to copy this nav element from our header and paste it after this paragraph. And by the way, if you need to change the indentation on anything, you can just select some HTML and hit tab to indent it to the right, or shift and tab to nudge it back to the left. And I'm just going to change the text in these links to buy and learn more. And to add this little right angle bracket symbol, we can't just type it in like that because this will confuse the browser because our tags are made up of left and right angle brackets. So we can use HTML entities to spit out symbols such as this. And to spit out this greater than symbol, we can just add and then GT for greater than, and then a semicolon. So I'll save that and let's see how that's looking. Yep, that's looking pretty good. And we probably don't want these links to go to our homepage. And if we don't know where our links are going to go yet, then just temporarily, we can just put a hash in this href attribute, which will just make them link to whatever page the user is currently on. So I'll just save that. And now we just need this product image here. So to get an image for free, I'm going to go to a site called pixabay.com. And I'm going to search for iMac and scroll down. And this is the image I use here. So I'm going to click on that and click on download, download again. I'll tick this box and click download. And it's downloaded that image. So we want to add this somewhere to the folder where our project is. So I'm just going to jump back to VS Code and show the sidebar again by going to View and Appearance and Show Sidebar, or you can use the keyboard shortcut. And I would highly recommend that you get to know all of the keyboard shortcuts for your platform because you'll just be able to work so much more quickly. Well, I'm just going to show that sidebar. And this is our folder here. So I'm actually just going to right click and create a new folder by choosing this new folder item. And I'll call this folder assets. And we'll place all of our assets, such as images, CSS, and JavaScript within this folder. So I'm going to right click this assets folder and create another folder. And I'm going to call this folder img for image. And we'll place our folder inside this image folder. So I'm just going to drag the image that's downloaded and drop it into this image folder. And by default, VS Code does this kind of annoying thing where it sort of joins your folders together, which is making it difficult for me to place this image inside the image folder. It's currently just inside the assets folder. So if we go to the settings page by going to preferences and settings, or using the keyboard shortcut, and we search for compact or compact folders, we can see this compact folders option. If we untick that, then it will now separate all of our folders and child folders, which is much better. So I'm going to close that, and it looks like it has placed it inside this image folder, so that's okay. So I'm going to close this image, and I'm going to hide the sidebar, and let's place this image after this nav element. And we do this using the image tag or img tag. So I'm going to type in img, hit enter. And in this source attribute here, we just place the path to the image that we want to display. And if I just open up the sidebar again, our image is going to be at the path /assets/image, and then the name of the file. And in fact, I'm just going to rename this file here. I'm going to right click it and rename it to omac.png, hit enter. And then back to this image tag and this source attribute, we can just set this to /assets/img/omac.png, and I'll save that. You can see the image on the page. It's pretty big right now, but we'll sort that out in a second. And this alt attribute, we can place some alternative text in here, just in case the browser is unable to load the image. Let's say the image gets deleted or something, then we can display some text as a backup. So I'm just going to type in omac in this alt attribute, save that. And so if I change this source attribute to an incorrect path by changing this to omax.png, then we can see our alternative text here instead of the image. I'll just change this back to the correct path and save that. And it's normally best to style things using CSS, but just for now, just to stop this image being so ridiculously huge, I'm just going to add a width attribute to this image, which will allow us to specify a width for it. I'm going to set that to 400, which means 400 pixels. So I'll save that. And that's looking a little bit better now. Okay, so this is all of the markup for our product. I'm just going to leave the one product on there for now, although we'll add some more products later on. So now we just need to add this footer. So we just got a really simple footer here with a border at the top and a little bit of text. So it makes sense to put this inside a footer element. So after this section element, I'm going to add a new line and we'll add another HR just to separate things out a bit. And we'll add a footer element. And I'm just going to put some text in here. I'm just going to put my name, Danny Connell, and then a copyright symbol. And a bit like we did with the greater than symbol before, to add a copyright symbol, we can do and copy and then semicolon. And then I'll just put the current year, 2021, and save that. And we now have a simple footer. Okay, so we're pretty much done with HTML for now. We've added our header, our product, and our footer, but this doesn't look very pretty. So let's add some CSS to make this page look beautiful and change it from this into this. But first of all, what is CSS? Well, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and don't worry about the name too much for now. But basically, CSS allows us to select an element that's on the page, or a bunch of elements that are on the page, and give it some style properties, such as background color, text color, width, height, font size, etc. And the easiest way to start adding CSS is by just adding a style tag to our head. So I'm just going to do that now after the title tag. So we just want to add an opening and closing style tag like that. And we can put all of our CSS here. And so CSS is made up of a list of rules. And each rule is made up of a selector, which tells the browser which elements we want to select, which elements we want to add styles to, and a series of properties which tell the browser how that element or how that bunch of elements should look. So let's add a rule which adds some style to our body tag, which is basically the tag which surrounds the entire page. So for this rule, the selector is just going to be body. So that's our selector. And then we just want to add double curly braces like this and hit enter. And we can place our properties in here. And we have tons of different properties like color, background color, font size, width, height. And I'm not going to cover all of them in this video, but we will cover quite a few of the most important ones. And so the text color on our page is currently black everywhere, which looks a little bit too dark. So let's make all of this text a dark gray color instead. And we can use the color property to do this. So inside these curly braces, we can just add color. And we can now assign a color. And there's a number of ways we can do this. We can add the name of a color, such as blue. And by the way, we want to end each property with a semicolon like this. So I'll save that. And you can now see all of the text is blue. And so why has all the text on the page turned blue when we only added a style to the body tag? Well, that's because styles that we add to elements will cascade down to their child elements. And because every element on our page is a child of body, then every element has also inherited this color property. However, if one of these child elements has its own color property, which is different from this one, then that property will override this style, which is cascading down. So for example, if we style up the P tag by adding P as the selector, and we set the color to red and save that, we can see that the paragraph is now red, whereas the headings are still blue, because those styles are coming down from the body tag, cascading down to those headings, and they're also cascading down to this paragraph, but we've just overridden that by adding a color property to the paragraph element specifically. And I'm just going to delete this paragraph rule for now and save that. And back to this color property. So we can use the name of a color such as blue or red. And there's a bunch of different color names that we can use. And we can also use a hexadecimal color code, such as hash 000000, which is the hexadecimal color code for black. Or if we add hash FFF, then this is the color for white. So you can see our text disappears because our background is white. And we can also use RGB color codes. So if I delete this and add RGB and then parentheses, then we can add a number for the red component, followed by a comma, and then a number for the green component, followed by a comma, and then a number for the blue component. So we're setting this to 0 red, 0 green, and 0 blue, which is basically black. And these numbers go up to 255. So if I change all of these to 255 and save that, then the text is now white. But I'm going to use a hexadecimal color code for this. So I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to set this to hash and then 6 threes, which is a pretty dark gray color, which is not quite black. So that looks quite nice now. And our body also has some space all the way around the edge. You can see this horizontal rule we added doesn't go quite to the edge of the page, and neither does any of this text. And that's because the browser adds some default style to most elements. And we can use Chrome DevTools to see what's going on here. And to open Chrome DevTools, you just want to go to View and Developer Tools, or you can use the keyboard shortcut here. And this will open up our developer tools. And one thing we can do in developer tools is inspect all of the different elements on the page. And we can see what style is being added to them, and we can adjust the style as well. So if I click on the body tag, we can see our color property that we added before. We can change that from here if we want to see how it looks. Oops, too many sixes there. So we can play around with our style within this tool. But anyway, you can see here it says user agent style sheet, and we can see it's adding a margin of 8 pixels to the body. So this style is coming from the browser itself, from Chrome. And every browser has slightly different default styles for different elements. But anyway, I want to get rid of this margin that's being added. And if we hover over the body element, we can see this orange border around the page, and that orange border is the margin that's being added. So I want to set this margin to 0. So if we click down here after this color property, we can add a margin property and set that to 0. And we see all that margin disappear. And so now we need to add this style to our style sheet. So I'm going to copy this margin property and paste it after this color property and save that. And that margin is now removed permanently. And this font that we're using isn't very nice. So I'm going to replace this with a fancy font. And we can find tons of free fancy fonts on the Google Fonts website. So I'm just going to Google Fonts, jump to the Google Fonts website. And I'm going to use this Roboto font, which is one of the most popular fonts at the moment. So I'm going to click on that, and we need to choose the styles that we want, and we're just going to need regular. So I'm going to click on this button next to the regular one. And we're going to need bold as well. So I'm going to click on select this style next to the bold font. And if we look over on the right, it gives us some code for implementing this font into our web page. So it gives us a couple of link tags here, and these need to go in our head. So I'm going to copy these link tags, and I'll paste them above this style tag in our head and save that. And it also gives us a CSS rule as well that we need to add, and this is going to go in our CSS. So I'm going to copy this and we'll add it to our body selector here. So I'll paste that in there, and if we save this, we now have a much better looking font. And I also want to hide these HRs, these horizontal rules, and to select those we can just type in HR, add double curly braces, and to hide them we can use the display property. And we want to set this to none and save that, and those horizontal rules have now disappeared. So what we've done here is set some kind of base styles for the whole page. So I'm going to add a comment above these to label these styles as our base styles. And to add a comment, I'm just going to add a new line at the top. To add a comment in CSS, we just add / and then asterisk, and then we close it off with an asterisk and /. And we can put anything we want inside this comment. So I'm just going to put base styles. And this is just a comment, so this isn't making our CSS do anything. It's just a comment which will be completely ignored by the browser. We're just using this to label our CSS and to split it up into a number of different sections. Let's add some styles for our header now. So we want it to look like this. So we want it to have a dark gray background, and we want our title or our logo to be over on the left and our navigation items to be over on the right. So after our base styles here, I'm going to add another comment. There's actually a shortcut we can use to add a comment, which on a Mac is Command and /, and it'll add that comment for us. And on Windows, I think the shortcut is Control and /. And if you want to see all of the keyboard shortcuts, then just Google VS Code keyboard shortcuts, and just click on this Visual Studio Code key bindings link. And then on the right here, jump down to keyboard shortcuts reference, and you can see all the different platforms here. So if you want to see the Windows shortcuts, click on Windows, and you can see a nice little cheat sheet here. So if any of the shortcuts I use aren't working on Windows and you're on Windows, then just find the correct keyboard shortcut here. Okay, so we're going to add some styles for the header. So I'm going to put the word header in this comment, add a new line. And so we want to style this header element, which has this orange title and these navigation links. And we could just use header for our selector like this and start adding some styles. However, later on we might have other header elements in our page or in our site. For example, you might have a product header or something like that. And if we just use the header element selector like this, it will style every single header element that's in our website. And right now we only want to style this header. So what we can do to be more specific with our selectors is by adding a class to an element and then using that class as our selector. So I'm going to go to this header element here, and just before the closing angle bracket, I'm going to add a space, and then I'm going to add an attribute called class, and I'm going to set the value of this to header. And to use a class as our selector in our CSS, we can just do dot and then the name of the class. And the name of the class is header, so we just want to do dot header. And we're now only selecting this specific element. Okay, so we want to give this header a nice dark background color like this. And we can do this with the background color property. So inside this selector, I'm just going to add background dash color. And by the way, in VS Code, you can see this IntelliSense, which helps you to see what properties are available and quickly add them to the page. And it also adds the colon and the semicolon for us. And I'm going to set this to the same color we used on our body text. So hash and 333333. And because all of these numbers are the same, we can actually shorten this to just 3 threes like this. And I'll also change it here, and I'll save that. And we can now see this gray background color on our header. And currently our heading and our navigation items are currently stacked on top of each other. But we want the heading to be over on the left and the navigation to be over on the right, as you can see in the finished page here. And we can do this by using the display property on our header. So I'm going to add a property called display, and we want to set this to flex. And this flex property will turn this element into a row with all of its direct child elements. So this H1 and this nav element displayed side by side within that row. So you can see this title and these nav items are now side by side. However, we don't want these items right next to each other like this. We want the nav items to be right over here. So to do this, we can use the justify content property. And we can set this to a bunch of different things, such as center, to place those elements in the center of the row. Or we can set it to flex end, to force all of the child elements over onto the right. But what we want to do is spread our items out across the whole of this row. So essentially, we want to put space in between the elements. And to do that, we can set this to space between. I'll save that. And we can now see our title is over on the left and our nav items are over on the right. So let's add some style to these links in our header, because they currently have this horrible purple color. And again, that's a default style that's coming from the browser. And if you have your Chrome DevTools open and you click on this little button up here, we can click on an element to see what's going on. So if we scroll down here, we can't actually see this purple color anywhere, but it is being added by the browser. And if we go to this computed tab, we can see it here, this purple color. So I'm going to set the color of these links to a nice light gray color. And so we want to select all of these A tags that are within this header. And to do that, we can just, again, add dot header, and then after that, A, because we want to select the A tags that are inside the header. So this is basically just saying select all of the A tags which are inside this parent with a class of header. So I'm going to set the color property to a light gray color. So I'm going to use hash CCC, and I'll save that. And that looks a little bit better. And I also want to get rid of these underlines And we can do that with the text decoration property. So I'm going to set the text decoration to none. And we see those underlines disappear. And I'm going to reduce the font size on these as well. I can do that with the font-size property. And there's a number of different types of values we can add. So we can add a pixel value such as 14 pixels, which will basically set the height of the text to 14 pixels. And we can also use rems and EMs. I'm not going to get into those too much right now. So we have rems, we have EMs, but the simplest one to understand is pixels. So I'm just going to be using pixels in this video, and I'm going to set the font size to 14 pixels, and I'll save that. And I'd also like these links to change color when we hover over them. Right now they just stay the same. And it's better if the color changes so that the user knows that these can be clicked on. And to style an element that's being hovered, we can use a pseudo selector. So what we can do is, again, add .header A, but now we want to add a colon and then hover as our selector. So this is basically saying add these styles to all A tags that are within the element which has a class of header, which are currently being hovered. So these styles we add here will only be added when we actually hover over an element. So when we do hover over the element, I want to change the color. So I'm going to change the color to white, and I'll save that. And if I hover over these elements, we can see them change to white when we hover over them. We can also add a little bit of an animation to this so that the color doesn't suddenly change, but gradually changes from the light gray to the white by using the transition property. And we want to add this transition property to the element itself rather than the pseudo selector. So we'll add that here where we're selecting the A tag within the header. So we want to add a transition property, and we can specify a CSS property which we want to animate, and we want to animate the color property. So we can just add color here, and then we can add a duration for this animation. So if I set this to 1s, as in 1 second, and save that, and hover over one of these links, we can see it very slowly change from gray to white when we hover over it. Well, this is a little bit too long, so I'm going to change this to 0.3 seconds. I'll save that. And we now get a nice subtle little animation when we hover over these links. Okay, let's improve the style of this navigation list over here. Currently, these items are stacked on top of each other, and that's because li elements are block elements by default, which will stack, but we want them to go side by side like this. And again, we can use the display flex property to do this. So I'm going to jump back to that page. I'm going to add a new selector, and what we want to do is set this UL to display flex, so that the elements inside it will be placed side by side in a row instead of stacked. So I'll add the selector. So again, we want to add .header, and we want to select the nav element and then the UL element within that. And we want to set this to display flex. Save that. And we can see these items are now stacked side by side. And we still have some bullet points on these list items, like these bullets you can see there. We can see a bullet covering up the word home there. And to get rid of that, we can set a property called list style to none. And I'll save that. And we see that little bullet disappear now. And by default, ULs have some margin and padding added to them. If we hover over the element here, we can see the margin in orange at the top and the bottom, and we can see the padding on the left in that green color. So I'm also going to set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0 as well. And by the way, margin is basically spacing that goes around the outside of an element, and padding is spacing which goes inside the element. And just to demonstrate that, I'm just going to add a border property to the A tags in the header. So I'll set the border to 1 pixels, solid and white. Save that. And we can see a little border around each of these A tags now. So if I set a padding of 10 pixels, you can see it's added 10 pixels around the inside of the element, because the border we added is on the far outside of the element, and we can see the space has been added inside the element. But if I change this rule to margin 10 pixels instead of padding and save that, you can see it's now added that space around the outside of the element. So that's the difference between margin and padding. I'm just going to get rid of this margin rule and this border rule and save that. And this heading tag we're using here is also going to have some default margin. And we can see the margin in orange at the top and bottom of the element there. So I'm also going to target this and set the margin and padding to 0. So I'll put this rule here. So .header h1. We because this title is in a H1 element. And we'll set this to margin 0 and padding 0. And now that we've removed all of the padding and margin around these elements, our header is looking a little bit small with no padding around the edge. So let's add some padding to the header. So I'm going to target the header element and add a padding property. And if we want to set the padding in all directions around the element, we can just add a single pixel value like this. So 10 pixels. I'll save that. So this is going to add 10 pixels padding on the left, 10 pixels at the top, 10 pixels on the right, and 10 pixels at the bottom. But we can also specify all of those directions of padding individually. So if I set this to 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, and 40 pixels, what this is going to do is add 10 pixels of padding to the top, 20 pixels to the right, 30 pixels to the bottom, and 40 pixels to the left. So it goes around clockwise, starting at the top. So top, right, bottom, and left. And margin works the same way as well. Or if we just want to set the vertical margin with one value and the horizontal margin or padding with one value, then we can just specify two values. So if we set this to 10 pixels and 20 pixels, this is going to add, in fact, I'll just save that. This is going to add 10 pixels to the top and bottom and 20 pixels to the left and right. And I'm happy with this amount of padding now. And by the way, I'm zoomed into the page here. So on a Mac, if you want to zoom in or zoom out, you can use Command and plus to zoom in or Command and minus to zoom out. So I'm just going to zoom out to 100% so we can see how this is actually going to look. Okay, this is looking pretty good. We need a bit of space between these navigation items. So I'm just going to scroll down to these UL styles. And after this one, I'm going to target the A tags that are within this UL, this unordered list. So dot header, nav, UL, and A. And I'm just going to add a margin on the left. And to do that, we can use the margin-left property. And we'll set this to 50 pixels and save that. And we can see it's added 50 pixels to the left of each of these links. So we now have a nice bit of space between our links. Okay, so this header is looking pretty nice now at this size. But if I close the DevTools and stretch this out, you can see on a really wide display, we have our title right over here and our links right over there, which doesn't look too good. So we need to constrain the content of this header to a particular width in the middle of the screen. Okay, so I'm going to set up a reusable class for this. So I'm going to add another section of styles between our base styles and our header styles. So I'm going to add a comment here, and I'll call this reusables, or you could call it generic or something like that. And I'm going to set up a class called constrain for constraining content to the middle of the page. And I'm going to give this class a maximum width with the max width property. I'm going to set this to 960 pixels, which is kind of a standard maximum width for web pages or for the content of web pages. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to jump down to our header in the HTML, and I'm going to surround everything that's inside the header with a div with a class of constrain. And the div is just an element we can use when something that we're adding to the page doesn't fit neatly into something like header or section or article or something like that. So you do see lots of divs on web pages. So I'm going to place everything that's inside the header inside this div. And by the way, I just selected everything and used Alt and up and down to move it up into that div, but your shortcut might be different on Windows. So I'll save that. And this has gone a bit wrong, and that's because we had this header element set to display flex, which was changing this into a row and making all of its direct child elements display side by side along the row. But now that we've added this div, this is now the direct child element of the header. So we now actually need to add the display flex rule to this div instead of the header, because this is now the element that we want to be a row, and these are the elements that we want to display side by side. So I'm just going to jump back up to our styles, and after this dot header rule, I'm just going to add dot header and then dot constrain. And I'm going to move this display flex rule and this justify content rule down into that. So I'm going to cut these and paste those in here and save that. And our elements are now displayed correctly again. Although because of this constrain class we've added, this content in our header now has a maximum width of 960 pixels. So if I just right click this and click on inspect and stretch the browser out a little bit and hover over the constrain element, you can see this little drop down thingy there, which says that this is 960 pixels wide. However, we want this to be in the center of the header and not over on the left like that. So to do this, we can just jump back to this constrain class and we can set the margin property. I'm going to set this to 0 on the top and the bottom, but then we're going to set it to auto on the left and right. And setting this to auto will force this element, this constrain element, to be in the center. So I'll save that. And now if I stretch this out, you can see all of the content of our header is in the center of the page. Okay, so I'm just going to adjust our CSS a little bit here. We're going to be reusing this constrain class later on to keep all of our product content here in the center as well. So this padding that we've added to the header here, I'm going to move it to this constrain class, because whenever you use these constraining elements and classes, you generally need a little bit of padding on those elements. So I'm going to move this padding up into this constrain selector, and I'll save that, and everything still looks exactly the same. Okay, so now I just want to replace this orange title with a logo, like this orange that you can see there. So I'm going to jump to a site called iconfinder.com, and I'm going to search for orange, and I'm going to scroll down till I can find something that looks nice. And in fact, I'm going to scroll back to the top and change this option here to free, so that we only see the free icons. This orange looks pretty nice, so I'm going to click on that. I'm going to choose 64 pixels because we don't need this to be too big, and we're going to download that. I'm going to open up the sidebar in VSCode and drag this icon into our image folder. I'm going to rename this to orange.png. So I'll right click, rename, then orange.png. Let's place this image in our header instead of this title. So I'm just going to hide the sidebar again and jump to this heading, which has the orange text in it. And I want to leave this text here, this orange text, because that's the title of our website. So it's a good idea for SEO purposes to leave that text here, but we can hide it later on with CSS. So I'm just going to break up these elements onto new lines like this, and I'll break up the text inside this A tag onto new lines as well. And what I'm going to do is wrap this text in a span tag, which is just a kind of generic inline element that we can use. So I'm just going to fire the wrap with abbreviation command and wrap that in a span, and I'll save that. And you can see adding this span tag hasn't changed anything here because this is an inline element. It's basically like the inline version of a div. And it doesn't add any particular style or anything, it just gives us a way to target a particular part of our content and then style it. So I'll jump up to our styles, and after this header h1 style, I'm going to add .header h1, and then I'm going to target this span. So I'll add span here, and I'll just set that to display none and save that. And we can see that text has now disappeared, although it's still on the page for SEO, for search engines and stuff like that. So after this span, I'm going to add an image tag by typing in img, hitting tab, and our image is going to be at /assets/image/orange.png. So in this source attribute, we'll add /assets/img/orange.png, and in the alt attribute, I'll just add orange, and I'll save that. And we can now see the orange on the page. However, it's looking a little bit big, so I'm just going to add a width attribute to this image. And in fact, let's use CSS to do that. That's the more correct way to do this. So here's where we're targeting that span that's in the h1. So let's add a rule after that. .header h1 and then img. I'll set the width to, let's say, 30 pixels, and I'll save that. And this image is now 30 pixels. And this image has made our header a little bit taller. And although the image is kind of in the vertical center of this header, these items on the left are not quite in the center. We can fix this by adding a flex property to our flex element, which is this constrain element, which is here, which is inside the header. So in this header constrain selector, we can add a new property called align items. And if we set that to center, save that, we can now see that all of these elements in our header are now in the vertical center. Okay, so I think we're done with this header for now in terms of CSS. Let's add some style to our product listing now. And if I just jump back to the finished page, what we want to do is improve the styles of all of the headings and the paragraph, add some styles for the buttons. And we want to use display flex again to display all of this text stuff over on the left and the image over on the right. And we also want to constrain the content to the middle of the page, much like we did with our header elements. So I'll just jump back to our page And the first thing we want to do is constrain the content. And we can use that constrain class that we added before in our reusable section. And we can use that class on this section element because all of our product articles are going to be within that element. So we can just add that class to this section. So class equals constrain, save that. And now all of the product content is constrained to the middle of the page to a maximum width of 960 pixels. And by the way, the reason that we used max width in this class instead of just width is because if the viewport gets smaller than 960 pixels, then the div will scale down, but it won't get any bigger or wider, I should say, than 960 pixels. Okay, so we've constrained our content, and now we want to use display flex to display all of this text stuff on the left and the image on the right. So I'm going to jump down to the markup for this article. And if we set this article to display flex, then it will make all of its direct children be displayed side by side in a row. And we don't want the H1 and the H2 and the paragraph tag all side by side going from left to right. We just want all of the text stuff and these buttons on the left and the image on the right. So inside this article, I'm going to add a div and I'll give it a class of, let's say, product-text, hit tab, and we'll place all of the text content and these navigation links within that div. And then I'll also surround this image within a div, and we'll give this a class of product-image and move the image up into that div. And I'll save that. And we now want to set this article element to display flex, which will turn this element into a row and display this div with our text and this div with our image side by side. So first, I'm just going to add a class to this article. We'll just call it product. And we'll add some CSS to this element. So let's add a new section of CSS with a comment. I'll just put product in there. And so we want to target the product class, which we've added to this article element. And we want to set this to display flex. Save that. And we can now see all of the text stuff is over on the left and the image is over on the right. And just to make sure both the text content and the image are vertically centered, we can again use the align items property. So I'll set that to center. That should be align items. Set that to center. And we can see the text and the image are both vertically centered. And I want to display a little border between each product. So I'm going to add a border bottom property, which will add a border just at the bottom of this product element. And I'm going to set this to 1 pixels, which basically means the border will be 1 pixels thick. Set it to solid, which means it'll be a solid border, because we can also set this to dashed and a couple of other different ones. But we usually use solid. So 1 pixel solid, and then we specify the color. And I'm going to set it to CCC and save that. We now have this little border. And I think we could do with a bit of padding at the top and bottom of each product so that we have a nice gap between the content and the border. So I'll also add a padding property here. And we'll set the top and bottom padding to 100 pixels and the left and right padding to just 0. So I'll save that. We now have a little bit of space at the top and the bottom. And right now, this text on the left and this image on the right are not 50-50. The text content is slightly wider than the image content. And I want these to be 50-50. So what we can do is target both the product text div and the product image div and add a property to those. And if we want to target 2 different selectors at once, we can just do that like this. So we want to target the product text div, and then we just add a comma and then add our second selector for the product image div. So dot product text, comma, and then dot product dash image. We can use the flex property to tell these elements how wide they should be in this flex row and whether they should grow or shrink. So the flex property has 3 values. The first property determines the base width of the element, and we want to set it to 50%. And the second value determines whether this element should grow, and I don't want either of these elements to grow. I want them to stay 50-50, so I'm going to put 0. And then the third value determines whether this element should shrink, and I don't want it to shrink, so again, I'm going to set that to 0 and add the semicolon and save that. And these are now 50-50. And I want to make sure this image takes up the full space of this 50% of this row. So I'm just going to target this image. So I'll add another selector here. So I want to target the .product image div, and then I want to target the image inside it, which is this image here. We want to set the width to 100% and save that to make sure this image always fills the available space in this 50% of the row, which this div is occupying. Okay, so now let's improve the styles of our text here, these two headings and this paragraph. So after this selector, I'm going to target this h1 tag. So I'm going to add .product text h1 because we want to target h1. That's in this div with a class of product text. And I'm going to set the font size to 48 pixels. Let's make this nice and big. Save that. And I'm going to reduce the margin below this heading a little bit. So I'm going to set the margin bottom to 25 pixels. Save that. And that brings this heading a little bit closer to the first heading. And then I'm going to change the font size of this second heading. So I'll add a new selector here, product-text, then H2, because this is a H2. And I'm going to set the font size to 21 pixels and save that. And that's a little bit smaller now. And I'm going to set the size of this paragraph, the font size, to the same size as this second heading. So I'll add product-text and then P, because this is a paragraph tag, a P tag. And again, set the font size to 21 pixels and save that. And we could do with a little bit more space between the lines in this paragraph. And we can do that with the line height property. So if we set this to 1 and save it, this will add basically no space between the lines. So I'm going to increase this to 1.4 and save that. And this just looks a little bit more easy to read with that little bit of line height. Okay, let's style up these navigation links a little bit. I'm going to scroll down to the markup and I'm going to add a class to this nav element. And we'll call this product-nav. Save that. And we'll use this class to style up these links a little bit. So I'll add the selector above the product image here, because in general, you try to keep your styles in the order of the elements that are on your page. So I'll add the selector here. So we're going to target the product nav, and I'm going to target the UL inside that, the unordered list. And to get rid of these bullets, I'm going to set the list style property to none and save that. And I'm going to remove the default margin and padding by setting margin to 0 and padding to 0. And to make these LIs inside the UL display side by side, I'm going to set this UL to display flex as well. So I'll add display flex and save that. And these items are now side by side. And I'm just going to add a bit of margin to the right of each of these links. So we're going to target the product nav element, the UL, and then the A tag inside that, because you can see we have these A tags within each of these LIs. You could also add the margin to the LI element if you like, but I'm going to add it to the A tag. And we're just going to set this to margin right and set that to 20 pixels. Save that. And we now have a little bit of space between these links. Okay, let's add some style for our buttons now and make these look nice. So if I jump to the finished page, we have these nice button styles. We have an orange button and a white button with some nice hover effects and animations. And it makes sense to add these classes in a reusable way, because if we just reload the page, later on we're going to be adding this cookies widget and we have the same style button in here as well. So I'm going to jump back to our page and I'm going to add a class to each of these A tags, these anchor tags of button. And by the way, I did a multiple selection there by placing my cursor, then holding down the Alt key and clicking again. This allows us to type in 2 places at the same time. And the shortcut might be different on your platform, so just check the cheat sheet. Okay, so let's add some style for this button class. And this is going to be reusable, so we'll put it in our reusables section. So .button. And for now, I'm just going to make both of these buttons orange, like this one, but we will create an orange one and a white one later on. So we want to set a background color. So I'm going to add a background color property, and I'm going to set this to #EF6 900. And I'll save that. And by the way, you can use this little color picker if you want to pick a different color. And I want the text color in these buttons to be white. So I'm going to set the color property to white, save that. And I want to remove these underlines. So like we did before, I'm going to set text decoration to none to remove those underlines. I'm going to add a little bit of padding to these buttons. So I'll add a padding property, and I'll add 8 pixels of padding to the top and bottom, and 16 pixels of padding to the left and right. We now have a nice bit of padding. And I want to add some rounded edges to these buttons, like you can see here. And we can do this with the border radius property. So we want to set border radius. Let's set it to 20 pixels. Save that. And we now have these nice round edges. And I want to have orange buttons and white buttons, not just orange buttons. So we have an orange one and a white one. So what we could do is we could have our basic button styles on this button class, and then we could have some additional classes to switch out the colors on the different buttons. So in addition to this button class, I'm going to add a space and then just add another class to it. And we'll add a class of button-orange. And then on this learn more button, which we want to be white, I'll add a class of button-white. Save that. And I'll jump back to our button styles. I'll add the button orange selector, and we'll move our background color and our color properties down into this selector. And if I save that, we now only see those colors on this button on the left, which has this button orange class. And we'll add a selector for the white button, so button-white. And this button is just going to be white, so I'll set the background color to white. And I'll set the color to the same orange color we have in the background of this button. So I'll copy this color code and paste that there. And this looks pretty good now. So we now just need some hover effects on these buttons. So after the button orange selector, we'll add a hover pseudo selector. So button-orange : hover. And when we hover it, we're going to change the background color slightly. And I'm just going to copy this color code and paste it here. And then I'll see if I can use this color picker to select a lighter orange color. So I'll just move the thingy over here until it's kind of a light orange. And let's see how that looks. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And let's add a hover color for our white button as well. So after the button white selector, we'll add button-white : hover. And we'll set the background color. And we'll just give it a light gray color. So I'll just use a color code we've used before, which is 3Es, which is almost white, but not quite. And that looks pretty good. And we want to add transitions to these hovers like we did on our links in the header. So we can just use this button class, which is on both of these buttons. Add the transition property. And we want to transition the background color property. So we'll add background color. And again, we'll make that transition last 0.3 seconds. Save that. And we now have a nice hover effect on each of these buttons. And these buttons look a little bit close to the paragraph there. So I'm just going to add a little bit of margin to the top of this nav element. So let's find the CSS selector for that. So product-nav. And we don't have a selector for the product nav directly, so I'll add that here. Product-nav. Margin top. And let's try 20 pixels. Maybe 30 pixels. And yeah, that looks a little bit better. We now have a little bit of space between the nav items and this text. And we have quite a lot of text here in this paragraph, so I'm just going to remove a little bit of that text. And by default, text in your editor in VS Code will just keep moving over to the right like that in one line. But we can make the text wrap onto multiple lines if we go to View and then toggle Word Wrap, or you can use the keyboard shortcut. And the text in this paragraph is now all wrapping. So I'm just going to get rid of a little bit of this text, maybe this much, and save that. And that's looking a little bit better now. If you found this video useful so far, smash the like button and leave a comment answering the question, would you like to see more content from me about the basics of web development, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? Also, would you be interested in a full course on these technologies as well? Okay, our product listing is looking pretty nice now. So let's add a few more products to our page. So I'm going to select all of the article element and copy that, and then paste another one after it, and then another one again. And I'll save that. And we can now see 3 products on the page. And I'm going to change this second product to a different product with a different image. So I'm going to jump back to the Pixabay site and I'll search for MacBook. And let's see if we can find a nice picture of a MacBook. And this one looks pretty good. So I'm going to click on that and download that. Then I'm going to open up my sidebar and drag this image into our image folder in the assets folder. And I'll rename this file to obook.png. Then I'll close this image and hide the sidebar, just get our page back on the screen. And so I'm going to change the middle product, so the middle article, and I'll change the source attribute on this image to the image we just downloaded, which is asset/image/obook.png. And I'll change the alt text to obook as well. Save that, and we can see that image there. And I'll just change the text here to the new obook in this H1. And I'll just change amazing to incredible and save that. So we now have two different products. And it'd be good if we could reverse the order on some of these products so that the image is on the left and the text is on the right. And one way we could do that is just by swapping around these two divs. So swapping the product image and the product text div like this. And we could do it that way, but we could actually do this with CSS. So I'm just going to undo that and put them back where they were, save that. And we'll use CSS to do this instead. So what I'm going to do is on this middle product, on this article tag, I'm going to add an additional class called product-reverse. And we're going to use this class to reverse the items in this flex row. So the image is on the left and the text is on the right. So I'll jump back up to our CSS. And after this product selector, I'm going to add .products-reverse. And to reverse the order of the items in this flex row, we can just add a flex direction property and set this to row-reverse. And I'll save that. And we can see these two items in this flex row have now switched around. And the spacing between these products is looking pretty nice, but I think we have a little bit too much space at the top of the first product here. There's a little bit too much space between the content here and the header, but I still want to keep the padding that's at the top of all the other articles. So how can we do that? Well, we can use another pseudo selector, which is the first child selector. So this article here is the first child of this section element. So we can use the first child pseudo selector to select only this article, this first article. So I'll jump back up to the styles, and after this product selector, I'm going to add .product and then a colon and then first-child. So this will only select the first child, which has a class of product. So just this product here. And on this first product, I'm just going to reduce the top padding. So I'm going to set padding -top. Let's try 20 pixels, save that. And that looks a little bit better now. And I also want to remove this border from the last product in the list. So the last child. And we also have a last child pseudo selector that we can use to do that. So I'm just going to duplicate this first child selector by holding down Alt and Shift and pressing down. And again, on Windows, the shortcut might be different. And I'm going to change this to last child. And I'm just going to remove the border on this last child. So I'll set border -bottom to none and save that. And we can now see that border disappear on the last product. But we can still see the border at the bottom of the other two products. Okay, so I'm happy with this product listing now. I think it looks pretty good. So let's just finish by styling this footer. And this is going to be really simple. If I look at the finished page, we just have a border all the way across the top and a little bit of padding around it. So the first thing we want to do is constrain the content of this footer, because you can see this text is right over to the left here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to the markup for the footer, which is here. And I want this footer to have a border all the way across the top of the footer, like you can see here. So I want this border to go beyond our constrained area all the way from the left to the right. So we don't want to add our constrained class to the footer. We instead want to add a div inside this footer and put this content inside that div, and then add the constrained class to that div. So I'll add a div with a class of constrain, and we'll move this content up into that and save that and jump back to the page. And this content is now constrained. It's in line with the other content. And let's add a little bit of style to this footer. And again, we don't want to target the footer element because we might have other footers in our website. So let's add a class of footer to this footer, and we'll use this class instead. So I'll jump to our styles. I'll add a new comment which says footer, and we'll target the footer. I'm just going to add a border top of 1 pixel solid, and we'll use that light gray color, so #CCC, and save that. We can now see that border. And we just need to add a little bit of padding as well. So I'll add a padding property, and we'll add 20 pixels of padding on the top and bottom, and then 0 on the left and right. Save that. And this footer now has a little bit of padding around it. Okay, so we're done with CSS for now, although we are going to add a little bit more later on. But we basically finished styling our page, and it's looking pretty nice. But we have a lot of style here on our HTML page. This is quite long, and it's making our HTML page a little bit messy. And this is not usually how we add styles to a web page in a style tag like that. What we usually do is put our CSS in a separate file. And there are many reasons for doing this. It keeps our project organized. And also, if we keep our style in line in the HTML page like this, then when we create more pages, for example, later on we're going to create an about page, then every time we want to change the styles, we would have to change the styles in this style tag on both the index.html page and on the about page as well, which would just be a nightmare. So we're going to move all of this CSS into a separate file. So I'm going to show the sidebar, and inside the assets folder, I'm going to create a new folder called CSS. Then inside that, I'm going to create a new file called style.scss. And you don't need to use this name, but this file does need to end in .css. And I'm going to jump back to index.html. And I'm going to copy everything inside this style tag. So I'll select all of that by holding down Shift and clicking right at the bottom. And actually, I'll cut that. And I'll remove this style tag and save that. And our page looks terrible again. But don't worry, because we're going to paste it into this style.scss file. I'm just going to indent this back to the left by holding down Shift and hitting Tab. And save that. Jump back to index.html. Now we need to pull this CSS file into this HTML page. I'm just going to hide the sidebar. And we can do this by adding a link tag to our head. And if I just start typing in link and I hit enter, it will automatically add a style sheet link for us. So to pull in a CSS file, we just want to add a link tag to the head, add this rel attribute and set it to style sheet so that the browser knows that this is a style sheet. And then we just want to set this href attribute to the path of our CSS file. And our CSS file is at /assets/css/style.scss. And if I save that, we should see our website become beautiful again, which it does. Okay, let's move on to JavaScript now. So if HTML tells the browser what elements to display on the page, and CSS tells the browser how those elements should look, then what the flip is JavaScript for? Well, JavaScript is a scripting language which allows us to make things actually happen on our page, such as showing an element or hiding an element, or loading some content within a particular part of the page. We can use it to create carousels, animated image galleries, and stuff like that. And it also allows us to listen out for user input and respond to it, such as when the user clicks a button, or when the user scrolls down the page, or if the user drags an element or something like that. So one simple thing that we could do with JavaScript on this page is to display a cookies banner at the bottom of the page after a couple of seconds. And we could add a button to that banner, and then when the user clicks that button, we can then hide the banner with JavaScript. And the quickest way to add JavaScript to your page is to just add a script tag to your HTML file. And we can add a script tag either in the head or in the body. However, everything in your HTML page will load from top to bottom. So if you have a really big JavaScript file that's being loaded in your head, then the browser will wait for that JavaScript file to load before it starts loading all of your page elements. So placing JavaScript in your head can actually stop the elements on your page from loading. So a common practice is to place your script tags at the bottom of your body tag. So let's add a script tag right at the bottom of our body. So we just need to add a script tag like this with an opening and closing tag. And we can place all of our JavaScript in here. And before we start firing JavaScript and displaying things on the page, we want to make sure all of our page has been loaded. And we can do this by adding an event listener to our document, to our page. So inside this script tag, we first want to reach out to the document, and we just do that by typing in document, and then we want to add an event listener to the document. And to do that, we fire a method called add event listener, like this, add event listener. And you need to make sure you capitalize the E and the L. And then we add parentheses like this. And this method expects 2 parameters. And we separate parameters with commas. And the first parameter is the event that we want to listen out for. And we need to put this in quotes. You can use single quotes or double quotes. And the event that we want to listen out for is the DOM content loaded event. And DOM just stands for document object model, which basically just means your HTML page and all of the elements. So we want to fire some code after this event has been triggered by the browser. So we add a second parameter here by adding a comma. I'm just going to stretch this out a little bit. And what we want to do here is fire a function. So we add function, and then parentheses, and then a space, and then double curly braces like that. And then with your cursor inside these double curly braces, just hit enter. And we can now trigger some code inside this function after this DOM content loaded event has been triggered. So basically after everything on our page has been loaded. And just to make sure this is working, I'm just going to fire a console log. And these are logs that the user doesn't see, but we can see them in our browser, in our DevTools. And it's just a really handy way for us to figure out if things are working in our JavaScript. So to fire out a log, we just fire console.log. And we're just going to log out some text here. So we want to put some quotes inside these parentheses. And you can use single quotes or double quotes. And I'm just going to log out DOM is ready. And I'll save that. And if we jump back to the browser and open up our DevTools and we reload the page, we can see in our console here, DOM is ready. And if you can't see this console, then you might just need to press the escape key. You can toggle it with the escape key like that. Okay, so before we add some more JavaScript here to display a cookies banner, we're going to need to actually create a cookies banner using HTML and CSS first. So let's add some HTML for our cookies banner. So after our footer, I'm going to add a section element with a class of cookies-banner, and we'll place our cookies banner content in here. And I'll just add a H1 heading, and I'll just put the text, this website uses cookies, and then I'll add a paragraph with some text inside it. This is a really annoying and pointless cookies banner. I'll save that and I'll scroll down and we can see this at the bottom now. And we're also going to need a button that the user can click to close this banner. And we already set up some classes for buttons, this button class and the button orange class for an orange button. So I'm going to jump back down to this banner and we'll add an A tag, and I'll set the href to just hash. Because this button isn't going to link anywhere, it's just going to trigger some JavaScript, and we need to add these classes. So I'll add a class of button and a class of button-orange, and we'll just put the text close inside this tag, and I'll save that, and we can see that close button there. And the first thing we want to do is constrain the content that's inside this banner because it goes right over to the left like that. So I'm going to stick a div inside this cookies banner with our constrain class, which we've been using to constrain content. And I'll move everything else inside that div and save that. And this content is now constrained. So let's add some style to this cookie banner. So we can use this cookies banner class to add some style. So I'll jump to the bottom of style.css and we'll add a new section here with a comment which says cookies banner, and we'll target the cookies banner class and we'll give it a dark gray background like our header. So I'll set the background color to the same color, #333, save that, and it's now got a gray background. However, we can't see the text now, so let's give the text a light color. So I'll add a color property and I'll set this to DDD, so a light gray color. And because this heading and this paragraph are inside this cookies banner element, this color property that we've set on this cookies banner section is cascading down to the elements inside it. Okay, so I'm going to add a bit of padding in this banner. So we'll add a padding property and I'll add 30 pixels of padding to the top and bottom and 0 padding to the left and right. Save that. And we now have a little bit of space at the top and the bottom. And right now this banner is right at the bottom of our page. So if we're right at the top of our page, we don't see it. So we want it to be fixed to the bottom of the page, regardless of where we are in this document. So even if we're right at the top, we should be able to see this banner down here. And we can do this using the position property. So I'm going to add a position property to this banner. And we want to set this to fixed, and I'll save that. And we now can't see the banner on the page because we need to tell the browser where this element should be fixed to. So we want it to be fixed to the bottom. So we can use the bottom property, set that to 0, because we want to fix this element to 0 pixels from the bottom. So basically right at the bottom. So I'll save that, and we can now see this banner is fixed to the bottom. However, it's now no longer taking up the whole width of the page, because when we make an element fixed, by default, it will just take up the size of the content that's inside it. So we now need to explicitly set the width of this element. We can do that with the width property. We want to set the width to 100%. So I'll save that, and it now takes up the full width of the page. And we have a bit more space at the top of this banner than we do at the bottom. And that's probably because this heading here has some top margin on it. So I'm just going to right click this heading, and we can click on Inspect to jump straight to this element in our element inspector in the DevTools. And we can see here that the user agent style sheet is adding some top margin and bottom margin to this heading. So I'm just going to add a new rule here to target that H1. So cookies banner H1, and I'll just set the margin top to 0. And we now have an equal amount of space at the top and the bottom. And I want this button to be over on the right here instead of underneath the text. And again, we can use display flex to do this. So I'm just going to jump to our markup on index.html. So we want this text, this H1 and this P, to be over on the left, and this A tag to be over on the right. So what we could do is set this constrain div to display flex, and then place our text in a div, and then place this button in a div. And then we should have one div with the text over on the left and one div with the button over on the right. So I'm just going to surround the text in a div with a class of cookies banner text, and I'll move the H1 and the P tag into that div. And then I'll add another div with a class of cookies banner dash button, and we'll place our button inside that. And I'll save that. And now we want to set this div with a class of constrain to display flex, but only when it's inside this section with a class of cookies banner. So I'll jump back to style.css, scroll down to the bottom. So I'll add a new rule here. So we want to do cookies dash banner, and then we want to target that constrain class. So dot constrain, and we want to set this to display flex. Save that. And we can now see the text on the left and the button on the right. But we want to add space between all of the elements that are in this flex row. So like we did earlier on, we can use the justify content property and set that to space between. So I'll save that. And now the button is over to the right. And now we have a little bit more space at the bottom of this banner than we have at the top. And I think that's because this paragraph is adding some bottom margin. I'm just going to right click that paragraph, click on inspect. And yeah, it does have some margin at the bottom, which is being added by the user agent style sheet. So after this H1 style, we'll target the paragraph tag within that cookies banner section, set the margin bottom to 0, save that. And this is looking pretty sweet now. So right now, this banner is always displayed on the page, but we don't want it always displayed on the page. We want it to be hidden by default and then display it on the page after a couple of seconds. So what we could do is use CSS to push this element off the bottom of the page so that we can't see it. And then we could use our JavaScript to add a class to the element after a couple of seconds. And we could use that CSS class to pull the banner back onto the page. So first of all, let's just push this element off the bottom of the page using CSS by default. And we can do this using the transform property, which is a property which allows us to move elements around and change their width and height and stuff like that. So I'm going to add a property called transform and hit enter. And we can do a number of different things with transform. We can rotate elements and scale elements up or down, skew elements. Well, we're going to use this translate Y property, which will allow us to change the vertical position, the Y position of the element. So we're going to use this translate Y property. And if I just put 50% in here and save that, you can see that it's pushed the banner halfway off the bottom of the screen. So we can now only see half of the banner, but we're going to push it all the way off. So we're going to change this to 100%, and I'll save that. And we can now no longer see the banner. So what we're going to do now is set up a CSS class, which pulls the banner back onto the page. And then later on, we're going to use JavaScript to add that class to the element after a couple of seconds, thus displaying the banner on the page. So after this cookies banner selector, I'm going to add cookies-banner. Then I'm going to add .show. So we're basically targeting the cookies banner element when it has a class of show added to it, which it doesn't by default, but we're going to add that class with JavaScript. And what we want to do is change this transform property again. So I'll copy that and paste it in here. And we want to set this translate Y to 0%, which will bring it back fully onto the page. So I'll save that. And if I open up my DevTools and find this cookies banner element, which is here, and then if I click on this CLS thing here, we can actually add a class and see what happens. So our class is called show. So we're going to type in show, and we can now see the banner on the page. And if we remove this class, and you can see the class has been added here as well. If we remove the class, then the banner is hidden again off the bottom. And it'd be nice if this was animated as it appears and disappears on and off the page. So as we did earlier on, we can use the transition property to do this. So in our cookies banner selector, I'm going to add a transition property. And the property we want to animate is the transform property. So we're going to add transform. Then we want to add a duration. So I'm going to add 0.3 seconds, add my semicolon, and I'll save that. So now if we choose our cookies banner element in the element tab here, I'll click on class and add this show class. We can see we now have a nice animation when it appears. And if we remove the class, we have a nice animation again when it disappears. So now all we need to do is use JavaScript to add this show class to the cookies banner after a couple of seconds. Okay, let's use JavaScript to add this class of show to the cookies banner element after a couple of seconds. So we'll jump back to our JavaScript in index.html, which is here, and we'll get rid of this console log because we don't really need that. And before we can do something with this cookies banner, we need to get access to it. And we can do that by firing the query selector method on the document. So what we can do is document.querySelector, and then parentheses, and then quotes, and then we can pass a selector into these quotes, similarly to the selectors that we're using in our CSS. So if we want to grab our cookies banner, which has a class of cookies banner, we can just use .cookies banner. So in these quotes, we can just add .cookies-banner, and this will grab the cookies banner element so that we can actually do something with it. But first we need to put this into a variable. And what's a variable? Basically, it's just a little block of data with a name. And we can store all sorts of different types of data in a variable. And the way we set up a variable is we just use the word let, and then we enter a name for our variable. So let's say we wanted to store someone's age. We might want to call that variable age, and we can set that equal to a number such as 30. And we can also store text or a string in a variable. So let's say we wanted to store someone's name. We could do let name equals, then we want to use quotes if we're doing a string. So Danny. And we could also store Boolean values or true and false values in a variable. So we might want to do something like let is user subscribed, and we could set that to true, or we could set it to false. But in this case, we just want to store this document element in a variable. So I'm just going to get rid of all of these. We're going to store this in a variable. So we'll call this cookies banner, like that. And this cookies banner element will now be in this cookies banner variable where we can do some stuff with it. And before we do some stuff with it, we want to make sure that it exists. Because if we try to fire some code on this element and it doesn't exist on the page, then this will fire an error. So we can use an if statement to do that. So what we can do is type in if, and then parentheses, and then in the parentheses, we can just add cookies banner. So in other words, if there's something in this variable, so if this element was found on the page, then we could do something. And for now, I'm just going to log out. So I'll use console.log and just log out banner exists. And if we wanted to fire some code, if the banner doesn't exist, we could add an else after this if statement and double curly braces. And in there, we could just log out console.log banner does not exist. And I'll save that. And we can now see in our console here, banner exists. But if I just remove this cookies banner section element from the page, I'll just cut it and then save it. We now see banner does not exist being logged out. So I'll place that cookies banner back on the page and save that. And we're not really going to need this else statement. So if the cookies banner does exist, then we want to add that class of show to this cookies banner element after a couple of seconds. And in order to wait a couple of seconds, we can use the set timeout method. So I'm just going to remove this console log and I'll just type in set. We can see in our IntelliSense here, we have this set timeout function. So I'm going to hit enter on that and it'll add this set timeout function for us. And this function expects two parameters. The first parameter is a function. So this is just a different way of writing a function, which is a little bit different from the way we've written this function. This type of function is called an arrow function. But we could also change this to function, double curly braces, and then get rid of this arrow. So this would also work, but I'm just going to change this back to an arrow function. So we can fire some code within this function after the timeout has finished. And this second parameter here is a number, which is the amount of time that we should wait in milliseconds. So if we wanted to wait for 5 seconds, we could just put 5,000 in here. So I'll change this timeout to 5,000 and I'll just log out some text for now. Timer has finished. And if we save this and reload the page and wait a few seconds, then we can see timer has finished being logged out. And I'm just going to reduce this timeout to 2 seconds. So I'll put 2000 here. And in fact, let's put this 2000 in a variable. So after this cookies banner variable, I'll add a variable called cookies banner delay and set that equal to 2000. And now we can just use this variable here instead of hard coding the number in. So I'll copy this variable name and paste that here. And now if we come back to this code later on, it's going to be really easy for us to change the delay if we want to. But anyway, once this timeout is finished, we want to add the show class, which we set up, to the cookies banner, thus showing the banner on the page. And we have access to the cookies banner element here. So I'll get rid of this console log. And what we can do is cookies banner, and we want to access the class list on this cookies banner. So we can do dot class list. And in fact, I'm just going to log this out so you can see what's going on here. So I'll add console.log and then surround this cookies banner.class list in parentheses and save that. And if we wait a couple of seconds, we can see this DOM token list being logged out. And if we click on this little arrow to open it, what we're seeing here is an array. And an array basically allows us to store multiple variables in one item of data. So if I jump back up to this cookies banner and we add another class, just add new dash class, and we save that and reload, you can see this being logged out again. But now we have two items in that array, cookies banner and new class. So I'm just going to remove this new class and save that and jump back down to our JavaScript. And I'll remove this console log. So we've got access to the class list of that cookies banner. Now we want to add a class to it. We want to add that show class that we set up. So we can now just add dot add and then parentheses. And then in quotes, we can add the class that we want to add. And we want to add the class show. So I'll save that and reload. And if we wait a couple of seconds, we can see our banner appearing. And if we look in the element inspector here, we can see that show class has been added. However, it's a good idea to break up our logic into functions. And a function is just a block of code that we can give a name. And you generally want each function to just have one purpose. So after this if statement here, I'm going to add a function. We can do this by just typing in function, and then we can give the function a name. So we could call it show banner. Then we add parentheses and then double curly braces. And then we could put the code for our function within these curly braces. So I'm just going to cut this line where we added the class and paste it into this function instead. And what we can do now on this set timeout and this first parameter, we can just select all of this function. So the two double curly braces, the arrow, and these two parentheses. And we can just delete that. And we can just type the name of this function instead. So it will now fire this function after the timeout is finished. So we can just type in show banner here. And let's save that and see if it's still working. Let's reload the page. And yeah, it's still working. And I'm just going to add some comments here to break up our code a little bit. And we can use the same keyboard shortcut to add a comment in JavaScript, which on a Mac is command and /. And I'll just label this stuff at the top init, because this is where we're kind of initializing stuff and getting access to our elements. And then I'll add a comment above our functions, which just says functions. By the way, we can also add comments to our HTML as well. So if we wanted to add a comment above this cookies banner, we could just use the shortcut command and /, or I think it's control and / on Windows. Then we can just type a comment here, such as cookies banner. Okay, so we want to hide this banner when the user clicks this close button. So when the user clicks this close button, we basically want to remove the show class, which you can see here, from this cookies banner, which will then move the banner back off the bottom of the page. So we can do this by adding a click handler to this button. First, we need to get access to this button, just like we did when we got access to the cookies banner using the query selector method. So after this line, I'm going to add let's call it cookies banner close button. Set that equal to document.query selector, and then parentheses, and then quotes inside there. And so we need a selector to select this close button. And we can't just use this button class because this query selector will just select the first element which matches the selector that we put in here. So if we just put .button in here, then it would actually select this button, which is the first button element on our page, this buy button. So we need to be more specific than that. And we do have this div surrounding our button, which has a class of cookies banner button. So what we could do for our selector is .cookies banner button, and then a space, and then button. So in other words, it's going to select the element which has a class of button that's inside the element which has a class of cookies banner button. So I'll save that. And we're going to set up a click handler on this button. So I'm going to add a new section after this if statement, and I'll just call this events. And first we want to check that this close button exists, like we did with the cookies banner. So we'll add if cookies banner close button. And if it does exist, then we want to add a click handler to it. And we can do this by adding an event listener to the close button by using this add event listener method that we used before. So what we can do is cookies banner close button dot add event listener, and then parentheses. And this time we want to add the click event listener. So we're going to add quotes here and then click. And for the second parameter, we need a function. So we could add a function like this directly in here and add some code here, but it's probably better to trigger a separate function so that we can keep all of our logic nicely separated into different functions. So I'm going to select all of this function I've added, and instead we'll trigger a function called close button clicked. And in fact, let's call it cookies banner close button clicked to make it a bit more specific. Then I'll copy that and we'll create this function down here. I'll add it above this function, so we can just add function, then paste in cookies banner close button clicked, parentheses, and for now let's just log out some text. So console.log close button was clicked to make sure this is working. So I'll save that, wait for the banner to appear, click on the close button, and we can see close button was clicked, so that's working. And if we're down at the bottom of the page and we click on this close button, it's jumping us to the top. And that's because when we click on this button, the href is set to hash. And we can use the hash to jump to various anchors on our page. And I'm not going to get into that now, but if we don't specify a name for an anchor, then it will just jump us to the top of the page. So what we need to do in this click handler is to prevent the default behavior of this button when we click it, which is to follow the link that's assigned to this button, which in this case is hash. So when we set up an event listener like this, such as a click event listener, this will return what's known as an event object, which we can pass along to the function that we fire. And I'm not going to get too much into the event object now, but we can pass that in by just putting a variable name in these parentheses, and you can call it whatever you want. So you could call it event, or you could just call it E, and I'm just going to call it E. And now that we have access to this event object that was returned by this add event listener when the button was clicked, we can fire a method on that event object to prevent the default behavior of the click of this button. So we just need to add e.prevent default and then parentheses, and I'll save that. And hopefully now if we click this button, it no longer jumps us to the top of the page. But we still see our log being logged out, close button was clicked. Okay, so once the close button has been clicked, we then want to fire another function which will then hide the cookies banner. So let's fire a function called hide banner. And to fire a function from somewhere else, we can just type in the name of the function and then parentheses like that. So let's create that function down here. So function hide banner, parentheses, double curly braces. And so what do we need to do to hide this banner? Well, we just need to remove this show class from it. So much like we did in this show banner function, we can just do cookies banner, because remember we have access to the cookies banner element with this cookies banner variable. Then we want to access the class list, and this time we want to fire the remove method instead of the add method. So we just want to do remove, parentheses, and then quotes inside the parentheses, and then show, because we want to remove the class called show. So I'll save that. So we see the banner appear after a couple of seconds, click on the button, and we see the banner disappear. Okay, so we're finished with JavaScript now. And just like we moved our CSS into a separate file, it's a good idea to move our JavaScript into a separate file as well. Because if we leave our JavaScript in this script tag and we create some new pages, which we're going to do in a little bit, then if we want to make changes to our JavaScript, we would have to make the changes to multiple different HTML files. So it makes sense to have all of our JavaScript in one file so that we only need to change it once. So I'm going to open up the sidebar and the Explorer. And inside the assets folder, I'm going to create a new folder called JS for JavaScript. Then I'm going to right click and create a new file in there. And we could call this global.js. And you can call it whatever you want, but it does need to end in .js. And it's opened that file for us. So I'm going to jump back to index.html. And I'm going to cut all of the code that's inside this script tag and save that. And jump to this global.js file we've created and paste it in here. And I'll save that and then jump back to index.html. I'm just going to remove the new line on this script tag. So we just have the opening and closing script tags like that. And what we can do is just add a source attribute to this script and then enter the path to our JavaScript file. So this is going to be at /assets/js/global.js. So I'll save that and let's see if it's still working. So I'll reload the page and we still see our banner appear, and if we click it, it still disappears. Okay, so this web page is looking great now on desktop, but there's a couple of finishing touches I want to add. So I want to add a second page, an about page, which we can get to by clicking this link in the header. But first of all, I want to make this web page responsive, i.e. make it look good on mobile. Because if we open up our Chrome DevTools and click on this little devices icon here, we can choose from this drop down a mobile device. I've just chosen the iPhone 6, 7, 8 Plus. This will show us how this page looks on mobile. And the header looks fine, and the cookies banner looks fine, and the footer looks fine. Well, these products don't look very good because the text is too big for mobile, and we have all the text squished over to the left like this, and we have this tiny little image squished over to the right. So it'd be better if we could reduce the text size for mobile and stack the text section on top of the image and stretch the text all the way across the width of the device, and also stretch the image across the width of the device as well. And we could also do with reducing a bit of the space between the products as well. So I'll just show you the finished page here, and you can see I've reduced all of the text, and we now have the text section stacked on top of the image, and we're stretching the image out so it's a lot bigger. And we've reduced the spacing above and below each product as well, and this looks a lot better on mobile. So how can we add different styles for mobile devices? Well, we can do this with media queries. So I'll jump back to our page, and I'll just come out of mobile view for now, and we'll jump to our CSS file, style.css. And then at the bottom of this, I'm going to add a media query. So I'll add a comment here, which just says media queries. And then we'll add a media query. And a media query just allows us to add some CSS rules only for devices or browsers of a particular width. So we add a media query by adding @media. Then we add some parentheses and double curly braces. And inside these parentheses, we can put a rule which tells the browser which screen sizes the rules that we put in here should be applied on. And we can use either min width or max width. So if I just add min-width here, and then a colon, and I can specify a pixel value. So if I set this to, let's say, 500 pixels, then any rules that we put in here will only be applied to the page if the browser is wider than 500 pixels. So inside these double curly braces, we can just add CSS rules as usual. So if we wanted to target the body tag, we could just add a body selector. Let's just set the background color to red. I'll save that. And we can see the background has turned to red. But if I reduce the size of the browser to below 500 pixels, then it changes back to white again, because it's only going to add this rule if the browser is 500 pixels or wider. And we can also use max width instead of min width. So if I change this to max width and save that, then now the rules that we specify inside this media query will only be applied to the page if the browser is 500 pixels or less. So we're currently wider than 500 pixels now. You can see up at the top we're at about 1030 pixels. If we go down to below 500 pixels, then we see the red background color. So I'm going to add a media query which targets devices which are as wide as a typical tablet in portrait mode. So a typical width for a tablet in portrait mode, such as the iPad, is 768 pixels. So I'm going to set this to max width 768 pixels and save that. I'm just going to stretch this out a bit. So if we click on the device button and we choose iPad, we can see this rule is being applied. So we're going to add some rules here which will be applied on devices which are this wide or less. But we don't want to set the body to a red background color. So let's get rid of that rule and save that. And actually this layout looks pretty good on an iPad like that. So I'm actually just going to target any devices which are smaller than this. So I'm going to change this max width to 767 pixels. Save that. And we'll switch to one of the mobile devices such as the iPhone 6, 7, 8 Plus. And so let's add some rules to improve this layout. So each of our products is in a article tag with a class of product. And if we look at the CSS for the product class, which is here, we have that set to display flex, which is what is making its direct child elements be displayed in a row side by side. So in our media query, we want to target the product div and set the display property to something else. And we're going to set it to block, which will stop the product element from being a row and just turn it into a normal block element. So I'm going to jump down to the media query and we want to target the product element and we just want to set display to block. And I'll save that. And we can now see the text and the image are stacked on top of each other. And I also want to reduce the text size a bit of these headings and this paragraph. So after this product, we'll add .product H1 because this heading is in a H1. And we'll reduce the font size. So set the font size to 34 pixels and save that. And that looks better. And we'll also reduce the font size of this H2 as well. So we'll add .product H2. And I'll set the font size to 16 pixels, save that. And I'll also reduce the paragraph to 16 pixels. So we'll do .product P, font size 16 pixels, save that. And we have a little issue with our buttons here. They're being cut off at the bottom. And that's because these are A tags. And by default, A tags are inline elements. And inline elements will sometimes be clipped like this if their surrounding elements or their parent elements are too small. And we can fix this by just setting these to inline block instead of inline. So I'm going to jump back up to our product CSS and we have our product nav here and we're targeting these links here, product nav ULA. So I'm just going to set these to, in fact, let's just change the button class so that we don't see this issue anywhere else with our buttons. So I'll go to our reusables section and our button and we'll just set this to display inline block and save that. And these buttons are now no longer being clipped at the bottom. Okay, so I also want to reduce the padding on these products because this space is a little bit too big for mobile. So I'll jump back down to our media query and in our product selector, we'll add a padding property and the padding is currently set to 100 pixels on the top and 0 on the side. So let's reduce this down to 30 pixels on the top and 0 on the side. And we now have a more reasonable amount of space between each product. But we still have quite a lot of space at the top of the first product because if we jump back to our initial CSS, we use this first child pseudo selector to add some padding to the first product in the list, and that's currently set to 20 pixels. So I'm just going to copy this rule and we'll paste it below our product here in the media query, and we'll reduce this to 0. And I'll save that. And we now have a little bit less space at the top of our first product. Okay, so I'm happy with this now. I think this looks pretty good on mobile. And it still looks okay on desktop as well. Okay, the last thing I want to do is add a second page to this website. So an about page, which we can get to by clicking this link in the header. So I'm going to jump to index.html and jump up to the header. And here's our about link that's in the header. And I'm going to change the href to /about.html. And this is going to be our about page. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to open up the sidebar. Then I'm going to right click on the index.html file, click on copy, and then right click and click on paste. And then I'm going to rename this file that's just created to about.html. And if we click on that about link, we can see in the browser bar, we're now on about.html. But currently this page is exactly the same as our home page. So let's jump to about.html. I'm just going to hide the sidebar. And I'm just going to remove everything inside this section element with a class of constrain, which currently has all of these products. So I'm just going to select everything inside there and delete that. And instead, I'm going to add an article with a class of content, because this is going to be a content page. And we'll stick some content in there. So I'll add a H1 and I'll just put about orange in there. And then I'll add a bunch of paragraph tags with some lorem ipsum. I'm just going to enable word wrap by going to view and toggle word wrap. And I'm just going to copy this paragraph and paste a few more in. Maybe at the bottom we could have one of these white buttons which links back to the home page. So I'll add an A tag with a class of button and a class of button-white. Hit enter. And in the href attribute, we just want to go to home. So to do that, we can just go to the path /. And then for the text in the button, I'll just put go back home. And I'll save that. And we now have an about page. And we can jump back to the home page. However, this text is a little bit too small. And so I might just hijack the text styles from our products. So I'm going to jump back to style.scss and jump to our product text styles. So here we are, product text H1, H2, and P. And we've just created an article with a class of content here. So what we could do here is add an additional selector to each of these rules. So as well as product text H1, we could add .content H1. And then on this one, we could do .content H2, and then comma .content P. To steal these styles, I'll jump back to the about page and save this. And we now have some nice big text. However, we're also going to need to update our media queries because this text is a bit too big for mobile. So I'm going to jump down to our media query. And again, we'll hijack these styles here. So after this product H1, we can just add .content H1. And then on this one, .content H2. And then on this one, .content P. We'll save that. And the text looks nice and small on mobile and nice and big on desktop. There's one important thing I forgot to do right at the start of this video, which is to add a doctype declaration to the top of our HTML pages. So if you just open up index.html, and right at the top of this file, we need to add a doctype. And the doctype tells the browser what kind of HTML page this is. And we're using HTML5 here, so we need to add a HTML5 doctype to the top of each of our pages. So to do this, we just add left angle bracket and then exclamation mark, and then doctype in capital letters, then a space, and then HTML in lowercase, and then a closing angle bracket. And I'll save that. And I'll also copy this and open up about.html and add it to the top of this file as well, and save that. And this has caused a slight issue with our header. We have more space at the bottom of our header now, and that's because we have this image here. And by default in HTML5, images are inline elements which have a little bit of space at the bottom of them. So we can fix this by setting this image to a block element with the display property. So if you just go to Assets, CSS, and Style.scss and scroll down to the header styles, and you can see we're targeting this image here where we set its width. And we just want to add a new rule here, display, and set that to block. And I'll save that, and the header is now fixed. If you've enjoyed this video, leave a comment below and let me know if you want to see more content from me about the basics of web development, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Also, check out one of these videos above to see what's possible with web technologies. And please click my face over there and subscribe. Every subscription helps me to create more content for this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.